Hi, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on threat modeling. I'm really happy to be here. Uh, I see already there are some comments. Stephen, yes, there will be a recording. You will have a recording in LinkedIn, I think on YouTube, so you can check it out whenever you're interested. So for all of you joining in, thank you for joining in. Really happy to be here. In fact, this workshop has had quite a large number of people looking to join in. We've had north of 200 people joining in, or 200 people saying that they're going to join in from different channels. So I'm really happy to be here, and this is going to be I think our first one of the year, or the second one of the year. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm going to get right into the topic. I'm not going to waste too much time. I do have a very action-packed session today, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of things, but I'm really looking to cover a lot of ground on how I threat model, what I do in terms of threat model, some of the things that I've learned over the years, and some of the things that we've figured out as a team, and that's basically what I want to do with this particular session. So it's very, very important to me that I can provide this information to all of you, and maybe you can take this and do something with it within your own organizations, within your consulting practice, what have you. I'm hoping that you can take this and make the best of it as you are going on from here. Now, with that in mind, I am going to get started with our session today. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to present the, just give me a second. Let me start sharing my screen. And yeah, here we go. All right. So one of the things that I want to mention right off the bat is that this is a variant of the training that I do for companies. So AppSecEngineer, we and V45, we train at a lot of different companies. This is a training that I do for them, except that obviously because of time, I'm going to be crunching this down to a couple of hours, a max of a couple of hours. It might end up taking anywhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours is what I feel we are going to go for this particular session. If you do have questions, you can ask them. I will take them at strategic junctures. I'm not going to stop at every single slide, but I will take them at strategic junctures as we go through the slide deck. I do have a lot of material to cover, a lot of ground to cover, which is why I definitely have an eye on questions and comments, and I'll be putting it. I'll be answering them as and when I can. Especially because time is not, we don't have all the time in the world here. We have about anywhere between 90 minutes to a couple of hours, and that's what I intend to do with this particular session. Now, this session really is not so much about just about threat modeling. It's really about certain tips and tricks that we've picked up along the way that can help you do a better job of threat modeling. That's really what this session is mostly about. So I am assuming here that a lot of you have heard of threat modeling, might have done some threat modeling yourself. Some of you might have done a lot of threat modeling. So this session is largely oriented for people who have some, maybe a small bit of threat modeling expertise, but really want to get better at it, want to do more of it, or have to do more of it for certain requirements and so on. Right. So that is something that we're going to go into. Just a quick bunch of things that I want to discuss before I get started with the actual course is, one, this is going to be recorded. This is going to be available on LinkedIn. It's going to be available on YouTube. But of course, live is always better. If you can make it live, then it's always better because you can ask questions, you can engage, you have a lot of things that I can share, a lot of interesting things that I can share. So live is always preferable, but if you can't do it live, then of course you have access to the recording. You have access to it on LinkedIn, you have access to it on YouTube. And I think we also mail out access to those of you who are accessing it directly on StreamYard. So definitely this is something that you will have access to even after this session is done. So please don't worry about it in terms of whether you'll have access or not. Now, with that in mind, let me quickly share a little bit of my credentials. My name is Abhay. I am the head of AppSec AppSecEngineer and V45. So what are these two organizations? AppSecEngineer is the training platform. A lot of you might know us from AppSecEngineer. A lot of you might not know that I also run another company called V45, which is a security consulting and services company, which we do pen testing, threat modeling for a lot of companies. I've been doing training for a very long time. I've been doing threat modeling for a very long time. I've been in AppSec for about 15 years. I've contributed extensively to a lot of open source projects. I've written a couple of books. I also, from a threat modeling standpoint, my goal has always been to automate or scale threat modeling, right? And let me not use the word automate, because automate not necessarily always a positive thing. I've also always tried to scale threat modeling, which is make it more accessible, make it more scalable, make it more easy for people to follow and use. So I created a threat playbook, which is now not a maintained project, but at the time it was a very unique project that used to focus on doing threat modeling as code, where you could compose threat modeling as YAML. That was the first of its kind that was doing that. And of course, I've also since then built a lot of threat modeling automated solutions. I've also on the cusp of launching a very interesting solution around AI generated threat modeling. So security design reviews and so on. So this is my experience. I've been doing this for a long time. Every year I do a ton of threat modeling. My team and we do a ton of threat modeling, and we also train threat modeling at multiple events and at AppSecEngineer. So this is me, and this is why I'm talking about it. Now, threat modeling is something that's very close to my heart, because I really believe that threat modeling can truly solve some huge security issues that we're having all over the world today, especially as we build applications and scale applications, especially as we venture into the unknowns of new tech, with LLMs and AI and, with RAG and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that are constantly changing on us. And I really think threat modeling is one of those things that can help us get ahead of this. I truly believe that if you do a good job of threat modeling, if you do a good job of security architecture, you can really propel to a point where you can get the maximum benefit out of this, out of your security program. You can really get ahead of the problem with threat modeling, is what I believe in. I've also not only do I believe this fervently, I also have seen this. I've seen evidence with my own eyes with some of our customers who have been super positively impacted by doing a good job of threat modeling. They have been able to get ahead of their security issues, solve major security issues, and really make threat modeling, make their security program a much more manageable thing, rather than having to constantly deal with whack-a-mole type issues that you see with a lot of security programs. So threat modeling, that's what I believe, and that's why I talk about it so much. If you follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, you'll see that I extensively speak on threat modeling. I talk about it, share content on threat modeling. This is just another way of me doing that. Now, the nature of threat modeling, right? So one of the things that you will see with threat modeling is that there is no standard one way to do it, right? There is no one way to do it. In fact, if you ask 10 people who do threat modeling what threat modeling approach they use, you'll likely get 10 or even sometimes more than 10 solutions. It's not one of those super standardized practices. It's not a single solution practice sort of thing. So it's really what works for you. There are certain concepts that you can take and make them your own, and start to really use that as the basis of you being able to understand, you being able to do something with it on your own. And there are certain things you should be doing, and that basically makes it a more effective threat model. But that doesn't mean you have to only do one thing or one set of things, right? The idea of this class is to give you, or this course or this workshop is to give you ideas. So that's something that I want you to keep in mind. Now, threat modeling also depends extensively on all of these things that you see here. Depends on, you see the depends on section here. It depends on all of these things. Now, the better, so for instance, if the organization's culture is already security aware, and the team dynamics, and there is a sensitization to security, there's a relatively good amount of security maturity, you will see that threat modeling is much more, it's smoother, right? People take to it better. People appreciate it. People start to actually value it. In some cases, it's not the case, obviously. There are some organizations where this is not the case. This is just, it happens to be something that you have to force sometimes, or you have to push. In some ways, threat modeling today has also become compliance mandates. So if you see different compliance standards and regulatory requirements, threat modeling is a mandate. As part of that, you have to do threat modeling, which is in one way a good thing in my view, because that at least starts the conversation and starts to get people thinking about it and doing threat modeling and security architecture reviews. So I really think that in some cases it's easier to do threat modeling because your organization's already kind of set up for it. There already is a good deal of security maturity, but in some cases it's just not, right? So in some cases it's not. It's going to be much harder to do this because you might be dealing with a very hostile culture, which may not see security as a value add. You might be dealing with a system where security is basically considered, this is just a cost center. This is not something that we care about. If security didn't exist, if nothing would happen to us, we would just continue doing this as if it would impact us at all. So there are companies like that. I hope yours is not one of them. But there are scenarios where you are up against a lot of pushback for doing any kind of security initiative. Threat modeling even more so. The reason why threat modeling, a lot of people push back on threat modeling: one, they don't understand what it is; two, it takes time. A lot of people dislike it because it takes time, and three, it also requires a lot of people's time. So that is something that a lot of people don't like. They don't like to give. They don't like to have their time impinged on, especially because they think that it's less important. But let me tell you that, like I said before, threat modeling is one of those things that can really give you more time later on in your security program. People just don't see it that way because they think that it top loads time onto them. But anyway, let's get into all of that a little bit later. Right. So one of the things that you'll see in most of my classes is that I like this quote, and I go by this quote quite a bit. Just teach principles, not formulas. And threat modeling is one of those classic cases where you always have to understand the concepts, understand the principles, kind of crystallize those principles, and then maybe you can start applying it to you and not formulate. The threat modeling tends to be very difficult if you think about it in this step one, step two, step three, exactly this way, no change whatsoever, and it gets you the path. That doesn't work like that. There are certain principles that if you follow, it gets you to the promised land, but it's not always that you can use formulas, and there's no point teaching formulas. The idea is to understand from concepts and principles, especially as to how you can do things when it comes to threat modeling, right? So, like I said, it's an evolving discipline. You can, like I said, ask multiple people. You will get different responses, and it varies widely based on scope and focus. Now, most of the time, I'm not saying all the time, most of the time we are threat modeling applications. Now, what is an application? Now, an application could be a single, like monolithic type of application. It could be a bunch of microservices. It could be a combination, or an application or a system itself, which consists of one application and several other parts of that application. It may be, so whatever you consider as a system, you're typically looking at that for your threat model. You're typically scoping that as your threat model, right? Now you're looking at it from that perspective and then continuing with your threat model. And that's really what you need to focus on when you're thinking about threat modeling and how you to approach threat modeling, right? It is one of those things that is very scope dependent. And one of the things you should notice, or you should know with threat modeling, is that when you are threat modeling things, you should scope it to whatever your whatever system you're trying to threat model, or whatever the focal point of your threat model. If you try and take in everything into your threat model, it ends up becoming a much more diluted, much more time consuming, and much less effective exercise. So whenever you're threat modeling something, try and keep it to a particular unit or a system unit that you can actually get results out of. So if you're doing, let's say you're dealing with one team that's building a CRM application, yes, focus on that application, or focus on one piece of that application or one module of that application, given the time, the scope, and so on. Now, this cannot always be very clear. In some cases, this is easy to do. Some cases, it's harder to do. But in any case, or in any case, if you want an effective threat model, you have to understand how to restrict the scope or bound the scope to the point where the focal point of whatever you're trying to threat model is considered the scope of the threat model, right? So that is something that you have to do when it comes to threat model. If you don't restrict scope, or if you're not clear about your scope, I'm not saying restrict scope is perhaps the wrong word. If you're not clear about your scope, you are going to essentially have a situation where you're just taking in too much stuff. You're considering too many things that may not be in your area of focus. You can't even do anything about it. So let's say you're dealing with a threat model where you're considering every single third-party interaction that you're having, and you're also considering those third parties to be in your threat model. Now, a lot of times that's counterproductive, simply because those third parties that is theirs. That's their application that they need to consider. That is their application that they need to threat model. You need to perhaps look at the interaction between your application and theirs, but that's really it. Their application does not come into your scope, right? So this is one of the big things that I see with a lot of people who do threat modeling, is that one of the things that they get wrong is that they go into it with a lot of spirit and they take up a huge scope, and that scope also tends to be misleading and misdirected in terms of their efforts. So that is something you have to think about when you are dealing with a threat model. So scoping a threat model is going to be very important, right? Now, a threat model is basically a systematic way of us breaking down risks, identifying what those risks are, and then identifying what are the countermeasures and what are the ways we can address those risks, and whether we've already addressed those risks, right? Remember, there may be some things that we've already done. You're not always threat modeling a new system. A lot of people assume this. In fact, I was talking to a bunch of folks the other day, and they're like, yes, threat modeling is great, but this should have been done. You can only do this at the beginning of an application development effort. That's not true. Threat modeling can be done and should be done at different. It can be done for applications that are in production. It can be done for applications that are being developed, or applications that are yet to be developed. A threat model can be done anywhere, wherever you can. If you don't have an active practice of threat modeling or doing security design reviews, you should consider doing it at any stage, right? At the earliest possible stage, because you can preempt a lot of issues that are coming by later. And as things go on, one of the things that you should be doing is looking at either threat modeling features or threat modeling when there is a pretty big delta change to the application. So let's say I have this application, let's say I have a CRM system, and I'm integrating a third-party validation product into the CRM, or some kind of customer validation API into the CRM. That's when I should potentially threat model, because I am making a material change to the features. I am making a material change to the risk. Our PII is being exposed to a third-party system. So at that particular point in time, doing a threat model might make a lot of sense, right? So that is something that you should think about when you are doing when to do a threat model. So it's not always that you have to do threat models against a new system or a system that is yet to be developed. That's not true at all. In fact, I would highly encourage you to do this on existing production systems. You might get insights that are so useful to you that it'll actually add a lot of value to an existing product that is in production. This is something I see all the time. We threat model products that are in production being used by hundreds of thousands of millions of users. And because of the threat model, there has been a huge material positive change to certain security attributes or security parameters of that particular product or that particular application. So do not assume that it is only just, okay, I need to do this for a new thing. It is for products that are in production as well. So what is a threat model? It's basically a systematic process of us looking at a system, breaking down a system, identifying threats to that particular system, and then identifying countermeasures, and also, of course, validating whether existing countermeasures exist against that particular system. So that's really what a threat model is. It essentially becomes, in my view, I keep talking about this in every place I talk about threat modeling. What I say is that threat model is basically a blueprint of your security program. If you do it well, it's a blueprint, because it gives you a very clear map of how you should do this. and what you should do, right? And the more actionable it is, the better it is. Unfortunately, a lot of threat models are not. They become very, very generic in nature, and that's why people don't use them. People don't like them. That's why it becomes ineffective. But if you do a good job of threat modeling, you produce the right artifacts, you do the right steps, you should see that it gives you a nice blueprint of your security program that you can just apply, and you can start to measure things in a lot more meaningful way. And we'll talk about all of that stuff when we're getting into some of the things today. So when you're looking at a threat model, the scope, the first thing, like I said, that you need to do is think about a scope, right? You need to come up with a scope. Now, in a scope, like I said, you have to consider the which system or what is the focal point of your threat model, right? Now, let us say you are taking up an entire system, right? That may be the scope of your threat model, or maybe you're taking up one module or one service within that system. Let's say it's a huge system. There are lots of things going on in the system, and you're dealing with the team that's taking up one service within that system. That may be the focus of your threat model. So the idea here is that you need to first identify that broad scope of your threat model, right? Now, this really, you come to this based on a couple of things. One, if you have never done a threat model, you might want to consider doing it for the entire system and then start breaking it down. If you have already done threat models for this particular system, then you might want to consider looking at specific services and maybe focusing in on those specific services as the things evolve in a particular service and so on. So these are different things that you can do from a threat modeling standpoint. It's not always that you have to do this specifically this way or that, right? So that is something that you have to consider when it comes to threat modeling. Just give me a second. I think 1 second, please. I'm just going off screen for a second. Just give me a minute. I'll just be. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm hoping everyone is able to hear me clearly. I just thought that maybe it is a little slow or something may be wrong. So I just wanted to make sure that that was not an issue. All clear. Okay, great. Thank you so much. My apologies for that brief delay. Right. So, so like the first thing I said was you need to identify the scope, the focal point. Now, once you do that, you need to identify something that I call security objectives and security goals, right? So security objectives is a fancy way of saying what are the security goals for this system. Now, this sometimes is very clear, sometimes is not at all clear, right? Sometimes it's very clear because you might have compliance mandates, you might have internal security requirements, you might have a customer contractual mandate. These sometimes it's super clear. There is no question about, okay, this is what is expected of security. It's very clear. But most of the time, I would say at least 3 out of 5 times, you are dealing with security objectives and goals that are not very well defined. So you might have to come up with some specific ones based on either your internal requirements or your business goals. Now, a lot of times, the way I arrive at this, right, and this is kind of a pro tip. When the way I arrive at this is I ask a business representative. So let's say I'm doing a threat model for a particular product. I always tend to have a business spokesperson in the room. When I say business spokesperson, I mean somebody who is either the product manager, the project manager, the business stakeholder who is responsible for that product in the room for a threat model. And the question I ask them to arrive at this, right, the second part, which is security objectives, requirements, or goals, or whatever you want to call it, the question I ask them is, what keeps you up at night about this product? Okay. what keeps you up at night about this product or about this system. And the insights that they give you are really, really useful, because they may not tell you about, okay, I'm going to be I'm expecting that this Kubernetes cluster is going to get compromised by an ingress controller vulnerability. They're not going to tell you that stuff. But what they are going to tell you is that I'm really worried about an external user being able to access our models or our our past. So recently I was dealing with this insurance company, and they do a lot of work for the housing market, and they were really worried about one major thing, which is that one insurance broker should not be able to access another insurance broker's data. That would be a huge problem for them, and so on. So this sort of very simple business risk comes out in this, right? On when you ask that question, what are the things that keep you up at night? Very simple question. And it's a trivial question. It sounds really stupid, but those things kind of unlock very, very useful inputs for people, right? And also becomes a driving factor for your entire threat model, because you can start to focus on what keeps these people up at night, these areas of concern. These areas of concern become driving factors for your actual threats, your mitigations, your countermeasures, all of that stuff, right? So one of the things that I recommend you do, especially to identify security objectives, goals, what have you, is to ask that question, especially if it's not super clear. And most of the time, let me tell you, it is not clear. You don't have very well-defined things. Even when I've seen a lot of customer contracts when they're talking about security, they just say that, okay, you need to do input validation. They just give you some generic stuff. They don't really specify, oh, you need to do a reasonably good job of security. That's basically what they're trying to say. But they don't really have very clear indications. In some cases, very clear. We have a PCI mandate, we need to do this. And remember, a lot of times the compliance mandates that you have are kind of baseline, right? They're baseline. You have to meet them. Things above that is what you want to uncover, right? When it comes to threat modeling, not only want to uncover the compliance mandate stuff, you also want to uncover things that actually affect the security of the system. So using compliance only as a way to assess this, it would be a wrong parameter to take, right? So one of the things that you should do, and this is what I do personally, is ask this question: what keeps you up at night? What are your areas of concern? Those areas of concern actually become you can use that to form your security objective. So for instance, in that insurance company's case, like authorization is a major area of concern, or integrity of their quote or their quote system is a major area of concern. Audit trails across the system is an area of concern. So those things become your security objectives. You can start writing out, okay, authorization, role-based access control is a major security objective, security goal, or this particular thing in terms of log management or audit trails or whatever, that is a area that is a security goal. So this is a very important thing. It looks like, okay, you can do it or not do it, but this is actually, I would say, a very useful thing, because this kind of becomes a very important input for the rest of your threat model. Very important output, for the rest of your threat model, right? So that becomes a very important thing to think about. The next thing that you should do is ideally identify system assets. Now, system assets are typically the components that are in a system, right? In any given system, there are a whole bunch of components. You're going to have those in your system as well. So this is something you should think about when you're doing this. You'll typically have a diagram, or you'll typically have some kind of architecture diagram or component diagram. I would recommend you just use that, right? And reuse it for this particular purpose. Most of the time, we have some basic documentation. In at least 90% of the cases I've seen, there is some documentation. I would recommend we try and reuse those documents rather than try and create them for the purpose of a threat model. Now, let me tell you why I espouse that. A lot of people might think that, okay, what are you talking about? Shouldn't you have like specific documents for a threat model? Yes, that's something that you might create as part of a threat model. But if you're looking for perfect documents, perfect diagrams to start a threat model, unfortunately, in many cases, they don't exist. In many cases, they just don't exist. They just don't happen. So if you are trying to, so if you are doing a threat modeling process, which already people consider slow, and on top of that, you have to create documents, create diagrams, create boundaries, create all that jazz, then you are essentially, you are potentially having a recipe for failure, because people don't want to take too much time. So you need to make it as spiffy as possible, as effective as efficient as possible. So I would recommend reusing existing diagrams, right? So a lot of this might be in Confluence, it could be in SharePoint, it could be in Google Docs, it could be in whatever. I would just recommend reusing that. Even for the next thing, I mean, for system assets and trust boundaries, the idea here is for you to analyze what is within your system, what is out of scope potentially, what is a complete third party with something. When I say third party, it might not always be a full third party, it might just be another team within your application or within your organization dealing with a completely different service, right? But it's not related to this service, or it's not managed by this group of people. So that also, in my view, is third party in this for this particular definition. So I would definitely recommend reusing existing diagrams and documentation. There is usually some knowledge, there is tribal knowledge. In fact, today you can do things like you can do discussions with these people and then transcribe them using AI and use that as the basis of your tribal knowledge. So don't always look to create new docs. It's not always going to be possible. Reuse existing documentation, and that's the fastest way to get moving on this. I've seen a lot of people spend an inordinate amount of time on this stuff, and they kind of lose track of why they're doing it in the first place. So threat modeling tends to be one of those things that a lot of people lose track of simply because they don't reuse things that are already there, right? So that's something they should keep in mind. So these are some of my pro tips for you to scope things out, right? So how to scope, how to identify the scope, how to define security objectives. These are some of my tips. Again, if you do have any questions, please keep posting them. But yeah, this is just the scoping part of the threat model, and we'll take up the rest of it as we're going along, right? So like I said, when you're looking at a threat model, you're typically dealing with an application or service or a system, which is a bunch of applications and a bunch of different services. It depends upon how you want to do it. You can also threat model at the feature level, which is something we'll talk about towards the end of this class. Excuse me. So this is something that you are typically doing when you are scoping a threat model. All right. Now, let's, like I said, security requirements, security objectives. These may be customer driven, these may be internal, this may be regulatory. Like I said, how you can do this, especially if it's not very clear, ask questions about what are your areas of concern to the business folks, and they actually tell you, right? The more you jargonize security to business folks, the more disconnected they're going to be from security. And you don't want them being that way. You want them invested in this process. You want them taking threat modeling seriously, because they are the people who drive the business objectives. And ultimately, that's what drives the technology, that's what drives security, right? So that is something that you have to remember. Don't assume that, oh, these people are non-tech folks and let's not waste our time with them. They are the people you have to actually win over, especially when you're doing a threat model, because they are the people who sponsor these projects. They are the people who have the ability to make security decisions, even internally. I'm not just talking about, just as a, oh, I'm an external consultant, I need to sell these people. That's not what I'm talking about. Even internally. In fact, internally, you'll have to do a lot more of this, because you are always negotiating from a security perspective. So Daniel asks now or at the end questions. Please ask them now. I'll get to it whenever. You can just type them out and I'll get to it whenever I can. Okay, don't worry about it. So if you have questions, please type them out, and I'm seeing them. I'll get to them whenever I can. All right. So system assets. One of the things that I forgot to mention when I was talking about system assets was I maintain something called a data dictionary, right? Now, a data dictionary is pretty nice. What I do is I essentially, of course, we have the system components that are there. I also maintain a list of sensitive information assets that are stored, processed, transmitted by the system, right? So this could be PII, PHI. Again, try and be as specific as possible when capturing this data, right? Things like user credentials, or things like user healthcare records of a certain type, or whatever it is, right? So the idea is that you capture this, and you capture that the data that you have, or the data that you need to protect. So you're looking at multiple perspectives, right? When you're scoping the threat model, right? You're looking at the system, you're looking at areas of concern, you're looking at the assets, you're then breaking down the system, and then you are going towards threat model. You're actually doing threat analysis after all this. And this is really one of the best ways to do it, I've seen, because you're getting a very holistic perspective. You're not only getting a system perspective, you're also getting a risk perspective, you're getting an asset perspective, and all these perspectives tend to contribute towards making it a much better threat model than just having a system perspective or a attacker perspective, whatever, right? So I would recommend maintaining a data dictionary. A data dictionary is something you'll see. A data dictionary is sensitive information assets, a list of sensitive information assets that are stored, processed, transmitted, and their stepping stones. So let's say I have a web application that's talking to a database, and then talking to some kind of a third-party API, and it's talking to an encryption system. Then I have obviously some sensitive information assets that are part of my information classification policy. It could be customer assets, whatever. On top of that, I'm also dealing with database connection strings, passwords, whatever. I'm dealing with API keys to the third-party service. I'm dealing with I'm also dealing with maybe encryption keys to that particular encryption service that I have. So you're dealing with multiple things, and capturing that gives you a lot more clarity, because when you're actually framing your threats, those things, I'm going to show you how those things are going to start playing into your actual the thing that you do in order to actually do your threat model, right? I'm going to talk about an approach that I created recently called PWN-ISMS, and that helps you kind of do a much better job of threat analysis than what I was typically used to, or what we are typically used to. So I'll talk about that later on as well. So definitely maintain system assets, maintain your data dictionary as part of your system assets. Now, let's start off with actually doing some threat analysis. Now, since we're already almost 40 minutes in, I'm going to get into threat analysis. Now, I'm going to talk about two ways of doing threat analysis, and both these ways are I found useful, and the second way kind of complements the first way. So I'm going to explain both these things, and I'll get into it, and then you can, of course, you can start using it if you like this approach as well. So of course, everyone has likely heard of Stride. I'm going to do a quick explainer of Stride. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because there is a good chance that most of you who have read anything about threat modeling would have read something about Stride. Stride is something that comes up in every conversation about threat modeling, and it's a very common thing. But I'm going to talk about Stride, but I'll also talk about the second approach that I use. Right. So Stride is something that was created in Microsoft essentially for categorizing threats when you are thinking about threats, right? Now, when you're doing a threat model, one of the big challenges that you typically have, if you don't have a structured way of doing this, is what are those threats? What can go wrong? What are those threats that we need to consider? And if you don't have a way of thinking about those threats, you end up missing out a lot of stuff, and you end up having very incomplete threat models. And one of the ways that Microsoft realized that they could do a better job of this is to use something called Stride, and they created Stride as a result. Now, Stride is a threat categorization technique that stands for this, right? Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege, right? So this is what Stride stands for. Now, Stride, there are slight variants of Stride. There is one called Stride, which is basically a privacy one as well. There are some variations of this that have come by more recently, but I'm going to just talk about Stride because I really believe that a lot of the other stuff also gets encapsulated in Stride, and I think the other ones are, in my view, a little redundant in some cases. So when you look at Stride, the reason you have Stride is just to give you a way to think about threats. Now, human beings, when they have to think about threats, they need to have a structured method of doing this. This is, for instance, when you're using something like an LLM or AI or something like that, Stride, I don't see it being that useful, to be honest. It doesn't make it very useful for an LLM to use something like a Stride, simply because it's not a human. It's basically, it needs to analyze threats based on a certain approach. Whereas as a human, when you're thinking about it in your own brain and you're trying to reason it out, Stride is a way to think about threats and categorize certain threats. It doesn't mean that those threats can't play into different categories. So if you see, you will see that a lot of threat scenarios can kind of walk multiple Stride categories, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the idea is to think about it from one perspective to another, go from one domain to another, or one category to another very clearly, so that you understand what that category is and what are the threats in that particular category, right? So let's start with the first one, which is spoofing. Now, spoofing is an authentication related threat, or any authentication related threats. Anything that thrives on masquerading or imitation is basically spoofing, which is basically authentication, right? If I'm able to access a user's account by stealing their password, I have spoofed. If I'm able to steal their credentials over a network and I am able to access their account, I have spoofed. If I'm able to do a cross-site scripting attack and then steal their session tokens because of that and then leverage that, I've spoofed. In fact, the Next.js, how many of you have recently come across the Next.js vulnerability that is out there? I think that's CVE 2025 29927 or 29947 or something like that. So that basically, that vulnerability, if you've come across that, so that vulnerability is basically this, right? So Next.js has an auth middleware, and if you could guess the name of the middleware on a particular page, or if you are able to enter the name of the middleware in a particular HTTP header, there would be no auth check done on that particular page, which means you could bypass all the authentication authorization checks. So that's basically spoofing, right? You're spoofing because you're adding a specific type of HTTP header, and you're spoofing a process, which is basically the weakness in Next.js that just allows somebody to guess this particular header and use that guessed header to then bypass any of these authentication middleware checks that it's supposed to do. That's a pretty serious flaw. That is a spoofing related flaw, because it is meant to defeat authentication, right? That is meant to defeat authentication, right? I have a question from Syed. I'm going to finish Stride and then get to your question, Syed. I understand. I might have an answer to your question, but I'll get to it once I finish up this part of Stride. All right. So spoofing is authentication related attack. So spoofing, essentially, you can spoof processes, you can spoof entities, you can spoof data flows. So these are examples of spoofing, right? I already gave you some of these examples. I'm not going to go too deep into the examples simply because I don't have too much time. I want to make sure that we cover whatever we need to cover. And the next one is tampering, right? So tampering, as the name suggests, is any kind of integrity-driven attack, any kind of integrity-based attack, right? If I do SQL injection and tamper with scores on a database, then I have performed a tampering attack. Or if I change some user record to some other value, and as a result that has some other kind of an impact, that is tampering. Or if I tamper with any other record that is supposed to have high integrity, I have performed a tampering attack, right? So this is really a tampering attack. Any of these attacks which affect integrity is a tampering attack. Now, when it comes to tampering, you will see that you can tamper again with a process, you can tamper over a network, you can tamper with a data store. So if I am doing an SQL injection attack and changing scores, I am tampering with a data store. I'm tampering with the process by tampering with the value of the dollar value of the product before sending it to the e-commerce gateway, whatever it is, and tampering with the data flow. I could just tamper with network traffic, right? So I could change network traffic and I could tamper that way. Now, let's talk about the third one, which confuses most people the most, right? Now, let's look at repudiation. Now, a repudiation threat is an attack against deniability. Okay, so let us say I am an attacker. I compromise. I'm able to do let's say an SQL injection attack, and I tamper with some value, and I also delete logs in your application, or I also do something that deletes audit trails or logs or something like that, or I access your cloud environment and I delete your CloudWatch logs for that particular time. That is repudiation, because I am removing the tracks of what I have done, or I'm erasing the tracks of what I've done, which means I have deniability now over that particular attack. Right? That is what repudiation is. Now, repudiation is typically a second order effect. It's usually not the same as you would see with the other categories. So when you typically do both spoofing and tampering, you have repudiation. Usually, not always the case. If you do both spoofing and tampering, you have repudiation. So I don't know why my camera just decided to change the perspective on me, but so apparently when I do these sort of hand gestures, the camera just decides that, oh, this means something. Anyway, but the idea behind repudiation is that it affects deniability. And if I'm able to perform an attack against repudiation, I'm able to basically create deniability for myself. I don't know who did this. I didn't do this. That's basically what repudiation is, right? So I can repudiate against a process. I can stop logging. So let's say I gain access to an administrative interface or an administrative part of the application, disable logging, and then do whatever I need to do. And that is basically process, right? I am repudiating against a process. Or I can repudiate against a data store. So I have, let's say I have access to a log server and I'm able to delete all the logs for a particular period of time. Then I have repudiated against that particular data store. So that is repudiation related attack. So this is usually a second order effect, right? So when you're writing out scenarios or when you're creating a threat scenarios, wherever you see the intersection of spoofing and tampering threats, you will also potentially find a repudiation threat. That's another pro tip, right? You can, wherever you see the intersection of spoofing and tampering, you will also find repudiation. So definitely look at that. This is something that you should consider explicitly, because these threats, right, or considering these threats can help you do incident response, tabletop exercises, log management, audit trails, a whole lot better if you consider these threats. People generally tend to ignore these threats because either they don't understand them or they have not really considered them deeply. But by considering this category of threats, you are really doing a much more thorough job of your threat model, simply because you are giving yourself the opportunity to actually identify real issues that can come up during incident response, or issues that can come up during DFIR, and it can come up during disaster recovery and so on, right? So this is something that you should definitely be looking at very seriously when it comes to threat scenarios, right? So this is definitely worthwhile considering. Information disclosure is something that I'm sure most of you understand. This is really an attack against confidentiality or against authorization, right? Against authorization. I am able to compromise your application and gain access to users' passwords, which I'm not supposed to have, which is authorization. Or just 2 days ago, if you saw the Kubernetes ingress nightmare vulnerability, which allows an attacker to craft payload against Nginx ingress controller on Kubernetes, and then gain access to the entire cluster and steal the cluster secrets and so on and so forth. That is information disclosure. It's probably much more than just information disclosure. It's also elevation of privilege, but at the very least, information disclosure, right? So any attack against authorization, right? You have X privilege, but you are able to do things with Y privilege, which is maybe an elevated privilege, and you're able to access data based on that privilege, is information disclosure, right? So this is something that you'll see again with data flow, data stored. It happens against all of these different sources. So I can gain access to an application, and I can tamper with IDs and gain access to other people's records. Or I am able to gain access to a data store and then gain access to user passwords, which are unencrypted or poorly hashed or whatever it is. I have information disclosure. Denial of service. Now, denial of service is something that most of us understand, especially from a network standpoint. But there are different types of denial of service. There is also process-driven denial of service, right? So I can perform forced logouts of people. I can start doing any kind of bots, to affect certain processes of a certain application. All of that is typically denial of service, but not typically a network denial of service. So that's something that you should think about when it comes to denial of service as well. Denial of service, you will see, and of course, just deleting stuff. One of the things that a lot of people, an underrated set of denial of service controls is just, hey, this thing is down, or this data source is down, or this thing is deleted. Denial of service. Last year, on our AppSecEngineer platform, I remember this was 2023. So AppSec, the way it works is that every time a new lab spins up, we need to get a DNS from Cloudflare using Cloudflare's API. And Cloudflare had a it had a data center outage, and their entire APIs were down for a day, right? So really, it was in many ways a denial of service for us, because our users were not able to use the labs because the APIs were just not operational. And that happens. It does happen, especially in the cloud, and you're dealing with third-party services. So, in this case, it was not critical because they still had access to most of the other functionality, but it was still, in many ways, was a denial of service because there was an outage really in that particular service and that particular process that we were using. So, yeah, this is an example of denial of service. And considering this also is very important, because a lot of people, again, people tend to over-focus on elevation of privilege and information disclosure, and they kind of ignore some of these categories that actually have a pretty material impact to your application. So definitely do not ignore these threat categories, if you will. Right. So the last one is, of course, elevation of privilege. Elevation of privilege is really, again, authorization-related attack. It is, you have privileges of X, you are able to perform a certain attack and gain privileges of Y, which is an elevated privilege, and you are attacking a particular process to do that, and that's basically elevation of privilege. That's as simple as it gets. Now, it can happen at an OS level, it can happen at an application level, it can happen at a container level, it can happen between different services at any given point in time. So elevation of privilege is really using a process to gain access to an elevated privilege and perform certain actions with that elevated privilege. Right? So that is something you will see as elevation of privilege. So if you look at the stride category and the desired security attribute, spoofing is authentication, tampering is integrity, repudiation is authentication plus integrity, information disclosure is authorization, denial availability and authorization. Most of it is authorization related, if you see. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is how you frame threat scenarios. Okay. Most of us, I've seen this, especially with people who are threat modeling initially, or the first time threat modelers or novice threat modelers, tend to focus only on the attack vector. When you tell them to create a threat scenario, they say, okay, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, session fixation, authorization bypass. Now, that is not a good way to do it, simply because that is a very incomplete way to think about the problem. When you are looking at a threat scenario, you ideally should have multiple focus areas, because think about it. I can use an SQL injection to do a tampering. I can do repudiation. I can do denial of service. I can do the same attack vector can lead to completely different attack outcomes and completely different outcomes on your system, right? SQL injection can lead to 4 or 5 or 6 different things, or 30 different things. It really, the attack vector is only one part of the problem there. The other part of the problem is how that attack vector can be used, right? How can an attack vector be used, and what can it do? What is the outcome of that, right? So when you are writing threat scenarios, you should ideally write it as a single line story. I always talk about this when in my classes, and I talk about the fact that when you're coming up with a threat scenario, you need to write a threat scenario like a single line story, right? Attack vector, motivation, outcome, and if you can, capture the persona as well. External attacker performs SQL injection attack against to delete products in the database and cause disruption to the web application, right? Now, this is how I write a threat scenario. The reason I write a threat scenario this way is tomorrow, when I actually have to come up with countermeasures for this, the SQL injection, the primary countermeasure, maybe I can come up with parameterized queries and all that stuff pretty easily. That's pretty straightforward. But the rest of it, so the way I would handle the rest of the story would be very different. And it would be incomplete if I did not capture it as a story or a single line story. I hope that's clear to all of you. I hope you understand why I'm saying this. The idea of capturing it as a single line story is for you to get better countermeasures. If you just capture so what happens is you might do a threat model over a few days and you forget about why you captured it. A lot of times there's no context for this. And if you just capture SQL injection, you're missing a lot of context. So the idea of capturing it like so is to give you better context. All right. So this is something that you should definitely be thinking about when you are capturing threat scenarios. Now, so I have a question. I'm also going to show this on screen from Syed, who asks, which framework would you recommend conducting threat modeling on large language models or AI? Now, okay, this question is really twofold in my view. One is, of course, for AI-enabled applications, you can probably, you'll still use the same principles and the same approaches. You'll probably end up using the threat scenarios from an OWASP top 10 for LLMs in 2025, or the MLSecOps stuff that you have, leverage some of that stuff to do the threat model. It's not really a framework. The term framework tends to be overused by the security industry. I would really focus on what is the practices you would use, what are the sources of data. I would say that those are the sources of the data that you could potentially use. So I hope that answered your question. All right. Now I'm going to move on to the next approach, and this is an approach that I have started to use quite a bit, especially when doing threat analysis for my threat models. And I came up with this approach not too long ago. This is probably like 6 months or close to a year now. And this approach has helped me a lot, because Stride, I don't know how many of you have seen this, and you can raise your hands or tell, comment yes if you've had the same issue. Whenever I have done a threat model for a large system, I have found that Stride is overwhelming. It gets me very, very confused. In fact, it gets me more confused than if I didn't use Stride. That means there seems to be so many threats. I don't know where to start, where to stop. It gets overwhelming. So I have found that Stride just by itself, or just that threat analysis approach, I have found to be very overwhelming. Does anyone else have the same experience? Anyone feeling similarly, especially when you're doing a threat model or a security design review for a large system? Anybody faced similar issues with this, where you've had, there seem to be so many threats and so many threat scenarios that you have to encounter that it becomes very difficult for you to actually manage. Yeah, it looks like a couple of you are saying yes. So one of the things that I like to do nowadays is use this approach, and this is an approach that I created kind of an inspiration from multiple places, but really I've been using this for a while now, and I call this PWN-ISMS, PWN-ISMS, and this is basically an acronym for the following, right? It's an acronym for product, workload, network, IAM, secrets, monitoring, and supply chain. Now, what does this mean? So when I do threat analysis, I essentially look at all these layers to do my threat analysis. That's basically what this approach means. I first look at product-related threats, look at Stride in the product-related threats, go to workloads, then look at all the Stride threats in the workload-related stuff, then go to the network, look at all the Stride threats in the network-related side of things. Then I go to IAM, look at all the IAM related threats, secrets related threats, monitoring related threats, and of course, finally, supply chain related threats. Now, obviously, this kind of gives me a holistic end-to-end threat analysis rather than just using Stride. I feel that this works for me. Again, make of it what you will, but I found this to be a very useful approach in my thing, and I'll explain a little bit more about how this works. So the first one, so what I do is, like I say, I use PWN-ISMS and Stride together. Sometimes I just use PWN-ISMS depending on the system. I've done a lot of threat modules, so I end up kind of not using Stride too much nowadays. But for those of you who are still experimenting, I recommend using both. So you can look at each domain. So it's basically saying that I have a domain, which is PWN-ISMS, and I have threat categories within that domain, and I capture those, and I come up with your threat analysis. So that's basically what I do. And I found this to be very useful with LLMs as well. In fact, with LLMs, I'm able to prompt this a lot better, in the platform and stuff that we've worked on. I've been able to prompt this a lot better and get this value add with PWN-ISMS rather than just with Stride. Right. So this is something. So product, basically, product is this, right? So what are the key features of the application? How does it work? Who are the users? Basically, the product's functionality. So basically, it's the product's functionality. PWN-ISMS sounds like a useful expansion of the CISA asset categories. Yeah, I'd actually not heard of this. This is the first time I'm hearing of it. If it is, then it's great. I'll probably read up on it and see how that maps against PWN-ISMS. But yeah, sounds like I'm not too off base here when it comes to this approach. But yeah, the idea here is first to look at the product itself and look at the product functionality. The good thing about this approach, PWN-ISMS, is that it gives you a holistic, full-fledged perspective rather than just looking at it at a high level. You can actually go into the product's functionality and capture threats there. Then you can go into the workloads and capture threats there. Then you can go into other things and capture threats there. The ability to capture threats across the board becomes much more, you're much more capable of doing that with PWN-ISMS. Also, with PWN-ISMS, one of the benefits I've seen is that you can also hand off threat analysis to different people who are doing it with you. Right, so you might not be the best person to do threat analysis for networks, or let's say IAM. Let's say it's working on the cloud, and you are not too cloud conversant. PWN-ISMS can help you kind of diverge that practice out and make it a lot more inclusive and bring in other people who can do a much better job of threat analysis for other things and kind of bring it together once and for all. Right, so this I found to be much more helpful in that sense. Right, so the first one is product. Basically, you are looking at the features, the users, basically the product. What are the features of the product? What does the product do? What are the users of the product? What type of a product is it? What kind of environments does it have? What kind of development, etc. And then you capture threats related to that. Right. So this, then we talk about the workloads, which is this. Now, the workloads are basically the primary stack or the tech stack of your product, right? Where is it hosted? What kind of a platform is it? Is it typical servers, or is it running containers? Where is it running containers? Is it on Kubernetes? And the good thing about doing PWN-ISMS this way is a lot of these workload-related threats you can kind of get generically from that workload or from that workload vendor. Just give me a second. I don't know why my screen just disappeared. Okay. All right. Looks like I'm back online. I'm not sure what. Maybe there's a little bit of an issue with my connection. But anyway, so yeah, so the idea is to have workloads, the workload related threats, to capture them separately. And the reason I've provided this mind map, by the way, I'm also going to be sharing this slide deck, so don't worry about it. You will have access to the slide deck even after the class. So I will include it in the LinkedIn video and stuff like that. So next one is networks. In the network, what you're essentially looking at is what are the different types of networking practices or networking implementations that you have in this particular system, right? So how do workloads talk to each other? How do operators connect to workloads? So how do operators connect to workloads and actually manage workloads? All of those things that relate to a network is captured here, right? So in the network related threats. So the idea is that I have come up with this mind map of sorts just to ask better questions. So this just helps me ask better questions so that when I'm doing my threat analysis, I can ask better questions and then come up with my threat analysis based on those questions by validating those questions or having those questions answered, right? So that is something that I have done here, right? So you'll see that the mind map essentially orients itself towards questions that can be answered based on your analysis, based on your understanding of the system, based on others' understanding of the system as well. So that is something that you can do. Then IAM is basically identity and access management. And this is the place that most of us would end up spending the most amount of time on, really. Because if you look at the threat concentration or the threat scenario concentration, it's largely going to be around access control, authentication, and identity management, right? It's really going to be around these topics. So this is where you should ideally spend most of your time. You will end up spending most of your time. How do people access? How do people connect? Where does the identity come from? Is it consistent? All of that stuff, right? So those are the questions that you pretty much get into here. What kind of authorization is there? What kind of access control is there for users, for users against data sets, so on and so forth. So this is something that you'll see quite a bit of. Secrets. Now, this is an underrated set of threat scenarios, and I generally see that people miss out on capturing a good deal of threat scenarios here. And that's why I called it out as a separate category, secrets. Now, secrets essentially are, today, the reason why this has become a separate category for me and not part of, let's say, workloads, is simply because there are, in modern applications, especially if you're running cloud-based applications, you have a ton of secrets that you need to manage, right? And secrets not only in the application environment, secrets also in CI/CD, secrets also in other places, right? Developer machines, etc., etc. You have a lot of different secrets in different places. So this actually is, in my view, very, very critical. And I think having a specific set of threat analysis done for secrets is going to be very, very critical. So this is why I captured secrets as its own category. Right? Monitoring. Now, this is also a severely underrated but highly essential category in my view, because a lot of threats or a lot of threat scenarios essentially emerge from the fact that people don't do anything about this at all, or don't do nearly enough about this at all, especially when it comes to monitoring and logging. they don't think about these things. They don't plan for it. A lot of times it ends up just being completely missed out. So identifying these threats can provide a lot of insight to you, to the team that's working with you on the threat model, and the team that is eventually the consumer of this threat model, as to how they should do this and actually how they should make sense of this. So this is monitoring. And finally, we have supply chain security, which is, of course, nowadays a very, very critical dimension of security that we all need to think about quite a bit. So supply chain security as to how the CI/CD is set up, what kind of containers, what is the provenance, how are those things validated? Do you have a practice of things like SBOMs, all of that stuff, right? So those things become very, very critical when dealing with supply chain security. And you'll see that this is also a very heavily loaded with threats category, right? Because you have a lot of threats in this, and a lot of times the organization or the team that you're dealing with has no answers to a lot of these questions. So this is something that you have to consider extensively when you're doing threat analysis. So this is PWN-ISMS. Now I'm going to quickly walk you through a case that I've built out. This is not a full case. I just built this out before before the start of today's event, and I'm just going to show you how this works. So this is a system. This is a case study that I cover a lot in our trainings, and I'm just sharing my approach to this. It's not a fully completed one, but it should give you an idea of how to go about this. I'll also try and share this with all of you. So this is a expense management app from a company called Acme. And basically it's a corporate expense management app, right? So users sign up. Users are basically their employees. Their employees incur business expenses for stuff that they do, go attend conferences or go on sales trips, etc., and they need to get reimbursed. And they submit their invoices, they submit their expense items, etc., and they get reimbursed for it. Their project manager approves the expense, and then it goes into an ERP queue for it to be paid out to the employee. So that's how, at a high level, this system works. Now you will see that there are some constraints that we've introduced, that expenses are typically between the $1 to $2,500 range. Project managers need to approve it, etc. There's some technology related assumptions. There is some diagrams that we have, basically explaining how the system works and where the system is, where the system has been deployed. So this is all on AWS. In this case, the system is entirely on AWS. And there's a front end, there's an API gateway, there are a bunch of containers, there is a queue, there's a primary DynamoDB, and so on and so forth. So the way I've done it is I have captured the PWN-ISMS. So I've captured each of them as IDs, right? So P001, malicious employee may be able to leverage authorization bypass to approve their own expenses. So you see, the way I have done it is basically captured the threat scenario, and I've also captured the way those threat scenarios can come to light. So I've captured the attack vector. These are product related threat scenarios, right? So project manager can approve expenses for unauthorized projects, or malicious employee could upload malicious files, blah, 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 etc. So this is product related threats. These are core functionality related threats that I've captured here. Then I've gone into workloads. Network, I have not identified any network threats here, but really I have started focusing on other things, which is, I think we have not identified any network threats in this particular case, given the system that we are dealing with here. So we've not identified network threats. IAM threats, we've identified a bunch. Secrets threats, we've identified a bunch. And finally, monitoring, we've identified a few things, and supply chain also we've identified a few things. So the idea here is that by breaking this down into the more at ease about my threat model, rather than having to deal with a lot of uncertainty, missing out a bunch of things, and so on. This gives you coverage. At the same time, it gives you comprehensive coverage. So that's one of the things that I like about this approach. And you can consider using it if you'd like. This approach works for me. You might want to, if you want to customize it and use something of your own, that's fine too, whatever works for you. Right. So if there are any questions at this point in time, I can take them before I move on to the countermeasures part of it and the rest of the workshop. We're about an hour and 15 minutes in. So, all right, I'm going to move on. And if there are any questions, of course. Yes. So the question from Mark is, does PWN-ISMS cover business logic threats? Yes, it does. The product-related threats are business logic threats. So whatever is in the product category are basically business. That is meant for business logic threats. So if you see privileged insider may be able to leverage direct access to DynamoDB and access expense information, or user may be able to leverage authorization bypass. These are typically business logic flaws. So yeah, this part of this set of product related threats cover business logic. That is the way to do it. All right. Sorry. All right, moving on. I'm going to go on to countermeasures. And one of the things that a lot of us like to do when it comes to countermeasures is that a lot of us just recommend stuff, right? When it comes to countermeasures, we recommend things that they need to do in order for this threat to be mitigated, right? Now, that is most of the time, in my view, a very naive view of things, because it's not always possible to apply the most effective countermeasure immediately for that particular thing. There need to be more options provided. So if you look at the countermeasures, can you share this example? Of course, yeah, I will share this doc after this, no problem. Yeah, so if you look at the objective of a threat model is to really arrive at countermeasures, and in many cases to also validate those countermeasures. So there may be existing countermeasures for this that you need to validate, which you can do through pen testing, through your security audits and stuff like that. And in some cases, you may not have countermeasures that are even applied, in which case you might have to apply. So that is something that you have to think about, right? So when it comes to countermeasures, one of the things that I like to use is the way that NIST SP 800-154 does countermeasures, right? So this is very nice, because what NIST requires you to do is requires you to identify multiple countermeasures for a threat. It also requires you to identify the cost of implementing that countermeasure. So it requires you to identify the effectiveness cost, the acquisition cost, the annual management cost, and it gives you an actual scoring system to do that. So in fact, NIST has this scoring system where the effectiveness score being from 0 to 3, 3 being the most effective, negative impact, 3 being the least impacted, right? So if you see the effectiveness score, which is a positive mechanism, everything else is a negative mechanism, right? Or a negative parameter. Effectiveness is the only positive parameter. Everything else is a negative parameter. So the idea is your control, if it's high on effectiveness and low on cost, that's the best kind of control, right? That is the best kind of control. So NIST gives you this nice little table where they say, okay, require a strong password with a strongly encrypted password hash, or strongly encrypted password hash. So the acquisition cost is 3, least impact, right? This is a very low impact thing in terms of the cost. Annual management cost, again, very low impact. Impact on functionality, low impact. Impact on usability, low impact. Impact on performance, also pretty low. Total cost of security is 15, and you basically calculate total negative implication into the security effectiveness. So the idea is that you calculate the negative implication into security effectiveness, and through that, you're able to identify a score that can help you decide whether to add that control or not, right? So that is a very nice, I like this approach that NIST uses because it actually gives you real understanding of how to do this, right? And how to implement a countermeasure rather than just blindly recommend that, okay, do this or do that. We generally tend to do this, right? Especially in security, we tend to have this sort of blind, saying that, okay, you have to follow these best practices. A lot of times, without thinking about the cost, without thinking about the impact of those practices on the platform or the application that we're doing it for. So this can be a pretty huge change. Right? So that is something that you can think about as well from a countermeasure standpoint. So you can look at all of these different types of validations and mitigations. In fact, I've also captured it here. So if you see what I have done here is, so implement RBAC and enforce across all functions of the application. Effectiveness is 3. Acquisition cost is 3, which is low acquisition cost. Management cost is there, which is kind of, I've mentioned it as 2, which is, it's there. There's a little bit of management cost, but it's not huge. Functionality impact is very low. Performance impact is very low. Usability impact is very low. So which means that this is very effective and also pretty low cost. Thank you. So this is very effective, also pretty low cost. You'll see that some controls are very high effective, but also very high cost. So you will also start to balance out which to work on, which to not work on, and so on. So I have a question here from Vishal who asks, just like the Microsoft threat modeling tool, do we have any tools for threat management for networking or infrastructure? Network and infrastructure really are utilities in an application environment, right? So for a system. So they are considered as part of this. I wouldn't say there are any specific tools for this, but I would just consider it part of a threat model. Anyway, so this is, I like this approach. I've started doing a lot of this, especially calculating this. I used to not do this before. Just like every other super enthusiastic security person, I would just go ahead and give them a whole bunch of best practices or practices to follow. And I would realize that there would be a big back and forth negotiation and discussion based on all this. But I have started now, what I've started doing is providing scores for this, for the countermeasure based on all these parameters. And that has actually been pretty useful because those scores tend to tell me what the actual meaning of this is. And people like scores, and at least some people like scores, not everybody, but people like to see that, okay, this is very high on effectiveness, it's also very low on implementation, we should definitely do this. Or this is very high on effectiveness, or this kind of medium on effectiveness, but it's pretty high on cost, maybe we should park this or not do this, right? This becomes a very useful signal for us to understand how to do this. So this is an approach that I've started to take. So countermeasures, this is one way of handling it. I think I would say that this is very effective simply because this gives you a nice metric to go by rather than just blindly trying to figure this out with so-called best practices. All right, I'm going to quickly change gears and move to Agile threat modeling. Now, this is the part of threat modeling which is, so far what we did was I explored threat modeling at a system-wide level, right? We looked at threat modeling for a system-wide approach. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the lens of this to a much smaller thing, which is your feature or your story, right? So basically, the idea here is to do something called continuous threat modeling, right? Now, why do we have to do continuous threat modeling? The reason we have to do this is because, let's say we do a full system threat model in Jan, and let's say we have an application that is constantly changing, the new things added all the time. If we have to do another threat model of the similar size, it does take a long time to do that, right? So doing a full system threat model every single time makes no sense. Instead, what we could do is do very specific targeted threat models for features as we are taking them up as part of an agile sprint. So when I say features, I mean user stories that you're taking up as part of an agile sprint, right? So this is basically what we call story-driven threat modeling. Now, story-driven threat modeling, as the name suggests, is for agile environments. It is for environments where our application systems, excuse me, that are fast evolving, that have a lot of features being built. I would definitely recommend using something like this for those kind of environments, right? Where application delivery is fast outpacing application security. This is where you can potentially use something like this. So the idea here is the overall idea of what we're trying to do with DevSecOps, really, or security in DevOps, is that we want to embed security in different parts of the cycle, right? In different parts of our SDLC or different parts of our cycle. Now, if we can get threat modeling done at the planning phase of our cycle, the benefit of that would be that as soon as we do this, this kind of becomes like a blueprint for the rest of the cycle. If we can come up with a threat model at the beginning of the cycle, during the planning phase of our cycle or our sprint or whatever you want to call it, this becomes a great way to actually extend security practices across the sprint. So that's something that I have personally found super effective, and I've seen that it has really made things a lot easier. So imagine that for every single Jira user story that you have, you are able to do a threat model, right? And you're able to provide some security feedback. That's basically what we're trying to do here, right? Simply put, that's what we're trying to do. So the problem with a lot of threat models is that, it's generally not very inclusive. They create all these beautiful diagrams, nobody uses them, and it ends up being this book or this huge document that nobody reads. Now, the idea behind what we are trying to do is to keep it moving, to keep the threat model like a living, breathing entity. And instead of doing threat models every once in 6 months or once a year, you are doing a continuous job of threat modeling for the features that you have. So that's what we're trying to do here. So you're modeling stories, you use the threat modeling outputs for the rest of the cycle, right? For instance, to give you an example of what I've done, a lot of times we have done story-driven threat modeling. We have modeled it during the planning phase of the sprint, and we have come up with security test cases that have been used by penetration testers to identify security issues based on these security test cases. We've leveraged the stories to identify, SAST routines that we need to use to come up with different attack models for DFIR and for detection engineering and so on. A lot of stuff we can do when it comes to threat modeling. If you do a good job of threat modeling, you can leverage it very effectively in the rest of the sprint based on the kind of features that you are building. So the reason we're doing this is because we are not trying to boil the ocean. We don't want to do a full system threat model. We just want to take up the unit of work in that, or the units of work that we're taking up as part of that sprint. And that's basically those stories that we're trying to threat model. So in a typical system model, we are doing the full system, but in this, we're just looking at the sprint. We are looking at just the stories we're taking up as part of the sprint, and of course, coming up with the same things. The same principles apply, except that this is meant to be much faster. The idea is to run this as part of a 30-45 minute cycle during your sprint planning meeting and get done with this. That's the idea behind doing this. So the way I would do this is basically like so. Let me actually get to that since we are running a little short on time. So the idea here is to have, you're looking at the scope. The scope here is user stories, right? Your Jira user stories, your feature descriptions, your feature essays, whatever it is. That is your scope. So let's say you're taking up 3 features or 3 user stories in the sprint, that becomes your scope. And the idea is to come up with something called abuser stories. So we have user stories, now we have abuser stories and threat scenarios for those abuser stories, and then come up with countermeasures and so on and so forth. So that's basically what we're trying to do here. So the idea here is you have a user story, which is something that is your unit of measure, your scope that we're taking up. Now, this user story, we are going to come up with something called an abuser story for that user story. Now, this is essentially how that feature can get abused. So, if you think about it, this is very similar to those security objectives that we talked about, right? Those security objectives that we talked about before. What are your areas of concern is basically an abuser story. What keeps you up at night about this particular feature is basically your abuser story. This is a very high level perspective of what can happen, what kind of abuses can happen against this feature or this functionality. That is the abuser story. From there, we create threat scenarios, which is basically all our actual threat analysis, which is how does this happen? What can happen? What is the attack vector? Who can do it? Blah, 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 all of that stuff. And from this point, we essentially create countermeasures. We can also optionally create security test cases. And I highly recommend doing this because security test cases are very useful when you want to validate whether your countermeasures are actually working. So John has the point, kind of like as an adversary, I'll attempt to MITRE ATT&CK technique in order to MITRE ATT&CK tactic. Kind of, yeah. Kind of. In some ways, yes, I would say that's true. I'll get to that. I'll show you how I write it. Of course, you can write it like this as well. So let's show you what a user story is. Now, this is a user story, or this is an example of a user story. Now, you may not write it exactly like this, but just to give you an idea of how it's typically written. As a user, I want to do something. I approve legitimate expense. So in this case, I want to do something so I can achieve something, right? As a project manager, I approve legitimate expenses of my team so that they can get reimbursed for their official purchases. So this is like our corporate expense management example, right? As a user, I want to search for the best deals on Acme Travels to rent my car for my next trip, whatever. Now, this is typically your user story. Now, the abuser story is basically a high-level what can happen to this particular story, right? This is a what keeps you up at night statement against that particular user story. So the idea of doing this is for you to get very specific context as to what can happen so that you can determine how it can happen. So the abuser story is what, and then you have the how, right? So that is very important for you to understand. So the idea of how I write an abuse, in fact, this is, so a bunch of us came up with story-driven threat modeling, and Microsoft has also started using this internally, apparently. And they added a very interesting way to create abuser story, which is much nicer than what we had initially created. And this is what they created. So as a user, I want to do something so I can achieve something without bad condition happening, right? So as a project manager, I approve legitimate expenses of my team so that they can get reimbursed, blah, 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 for their official purchases without employees or third parties being able to manipulate or otherwise abuse the process. The idea is to capture the negative condition, to say that, look, I want this to happen without the negative condition happening. You can also do what John has written, right? As an attacker, I want to steal, I want to get my illegitimate purchases approved through the system, right? So that may be an example of an abuser story as well. So this is also a way to write it out. But I found this to be a little bit easier for people to use, which is why I suggested it. But hey, whatever works for you definitely makes sense. Right. So another example of this would be, as a teacher, I want to grade each student's quiz, so the student gets a grade on their assignment without the student or third parties being able to tamper with the grade. I don't want some third party to be able to tamper with the grade. I definitely don't want the student to be able to tamper with the grade. Right. So that is an example of a abuser story. The idea of doing this is that you can leverage this information and come up with the actual threat scenario. To just give you an idea, this is an example, Acme Farms. This is the example. So this is a think about it like type form example, right? So type form, I'm sure many of you know what type form is. It's basically a form product which helps you set up forms, and people can fill out those forms, and you can essentially get those results and do something with those results, right? So in this case, this is a corporate enterprisey form system that we have. They also have they're typically deployed at enterprises for enterprise use cases. So they have a user management system, they have SSO, SAML, etc., etc. Yeah, that's right. So I'll get to that. So the high-level description, the technology, I just mentioned that they are taking up these user stories in the sprint. So as a customer admin user, I should be able to, let me just increase the resolution so that everyone can see. So as a customer admin user, sorry, let me just hide this as well. As a customer admin user, I should be able to invite or add users to the platform so they can manage the data in the forms, right? So this is one of the user stories they're taking up in this sprint, right? So as a customer admin user, I should be able to invite or add users to the platform so that they can manage data in the form without the invite link or code being leaked, right? So I've captured this as a abuser story. I have captured another abuser story without invalid or expired link working, right? Or without the link being guessable. So you will see that these actually work. If you've seen this, you'll realize that it actually works like security acceptance tests, right? The idea of doing this is that it actually becomes a sort of security acceptance test. So you can literally hand this off to a tester and say that test for all these conditions, and if there are any issues, then there is a security bug within the same sprint, right? So one of the benefits of doing this is that you can make this a lot more scalable. It is a lot more business risk driven, and then of course you once you do the abuser story, you essentially capture how that abuser story can come to life, right? Invite code in the logs, invite code in response after user creating the invite, cached invite code link which is available on search engines, privilege escalation. If I'm able to do some kind of an IAM flaw or do some kind of remote code execution, I can steal it, I can compromise the database, and so on. So the idea here is by capturing the area of concern, which is your abuser story, you are able to leverage that to create a much more specific set of threat scenarios for that story, specific to that abuse case or abuser story. And based off of that, you come up with threat scenarios, and you essentially have your developers just make sure that these things are addressed as part of that sprint in as security attributes in that sprint. Now, you might run into scenarios where implementing some of this is bigger. So let's say this lack of RBAC or access control checks on the invite functionality. This may be something that it's its own story, right? So this might need its own epic, its own story, its own treatment. You might have to deal with that later, or you might have already dealt with it. So the point here is that capturing it gives you the ability to traverse between things that you can do immediately within the sprint and things that you might have to deal with, or things that might become their own units of work post sprint. That's one of the things that this helps you do, right? So this is one of those things that you can identify. So that's I'll also share this with all of you. This is just a document to give you an idea of how to do this. So the idea here is that you come up with threat scenarios. So as I said, so this is a abuser story, for instance. As a salesperson, I want to be able to log customer deals into the CRM and register a deal and claim my bonus without someone being able to access my customers' details. So this is obviously a confidentiality related or an authorization related use case. So I can, how will that thing come to light given a standard web application? I can maybe do all of these things and potentially compromise that application, right? So the idea here is leveraging all these attacks, or leveraging all these potential threat scenarios, I can make this abuser story come to light. That's one of the ways I can capture the abuser story. Right now, one of the things you can do with mitigations is when you have a mitigation, look at the status, the scope, the size, and if the mitigation already exists, it can be added to the user story, or it can become a task under the user. It can become its own user story, right? If it already exists, then you probably just have to validate that mitigation. But if it does not, then it becomes its own user story, or it becomes a task under that user story. So this, think about it like a Jira or a ServiceNow or one of those bug ticket workflows that you have. Based on the size, status, and scope, you can decide either to make it its own user story or a task under the user story. So this is one of the ways that I typically have people run this as part of their Agile threat models. Any questions, folks? I am actually pretty much coming to the end here. I just wanted to check if you have any questions at this point. All right. If you do, of course, please, you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or post under this particular video. We'll try and get all these comments answered as and when we get time. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this session. What I wanted to do was today just give you a little bit of coverage on how you can do these two different types of threat models and some of the ways that I approach this, and maybe that helps out some of you and helps you do better threat models, better security design reviews. What are some good prompts to product managers to make sure that user stories include abuser conditions? When you say prompts, I'm guessing you mean LLM prompts. Is that what you mean? I'm not sure whether you mean that prompt or the generic prompt, the term prompt in general. But see, what are the prompts you can use? Oh, just hints, okay. What I would really say is that look at how this feature can potentially be misused, right? So that word, the term misuse tends to be a better word to use, especially when dealing with non-technical folks or business folks in this particular context. So how do you think it can be misused? And ideally, you should be doing threat modeling as a team, right? At least 3 or 4 people, depending on the size of the team, if not more. So the benefit is that you should be able to get some responses either from the product manager or from somebody else that, okay, this could happen, that could happen, and so on. And you could also ask leading questions, right? So if you already have some context as to what that feature is, then you could say that, don't you think this could happen? Stuff like that. That would be a way to, prompt them to understand how this could affect them if they don't have any inkling of that. All right. I have another question. How effective is PASTA threat modeling in this case? Now, PASTA is an approach. So PASTA is a framework that actually goes right. So PASTA is a system threat modeling framework. So first of all, I just want to be clear about that. It's not an agile threat modeling framework, or it's not meant to be for stories. PASTA is meant for full systems. It's really not just a system threat. I would say it's a full-fledged risk management framework of sorts. Right? It not only requires you to do threat modeling, it also requires you to do vulnerability analysis and then validate the threat model and then come up with a risk ranking and acceptability criteria. There's a bunch of stuff in PASTA. So I would say PASTA, to call it a threat model, in my view, is incomplete. It's inaccurate. I think PASTA is really a risk management system. And yes, threat modeling is part of that, but it's not the only thing. PASTA is much larger than that, I would say. It is effective. I mean, it's the same set of principles even there. When you're doing the threat modeling, even there, it's the same set of principles. But it really is about applying those principles that makes it either effective or not effective. The framework by itself is not more or less effective. Okay. Can you give more details about this workflow? When you say this workflow, I'm not sure what you mean. You mean the mitigations workflow? I'm not very clear about the specific nature of the workflow that you're looking for details on. If you mean the mitigations workflow, the idea here is you have your threat scenarios that you've identified, you come up. So let us say your mitigation is just about something pretty small, right? Let's say in this case, your mitigation is something like this, where you have, you validate invite code in the logs, or you invite code is not in the response. Now this can be validated pretty quickly in terms of your mitigate as a task under the user story. So when you're generating the invite code, you essentially make sure that the invite code is not in the response. You make this like a feedback. Now, in some cases, this is much larger, right? So in some cases, you will see that this can be a potentially larger scope thing like this, lack of RBAC, things like that. So that would be its own. RBAC probably will be its own set of stories, not even just one, maybe multiple sets of stories. So that is how to do it. Specifically to prioritize, I would really, what I would do is priority wise, I would take a look at which are the most repeating ones, which are the ones that most repeat in terms of the threat scenarios and the countermeasures. And based on the ones that repeat the most, I would take those up based on the severity of the threat scenario again. So that's how I would prioritize it. Are any labs available on PWN-ISMS for AppSecEngineer? Actually, PWN-ISMS is pretty new. PWN-ISMS is pretty new, but we have to put it up on AppSecEngineer. I should definitely look into that. Not there yet, but definitely I will look into this pretty soon. Question again from John. Are there any diagramming or threat modeling tools that complement PWN-ISMS best in your opinion? Not right now. There's something that I'm working on, and that definitely addresses a lot of this with the aid of LLMs and AI. I'll watch this space, and you should see some announcements from us sooner or later in this. So definitely something around this. What are different AI threat modeling tools and how you use them in threat modeling? Right now, there are a couple of these threat modeling tools. The idea is basically to leverage them with data sets, existing data sets. That would be the best way to do it. AI threat modeling tools without your existing context and data sets don't make much sense. So that is typically how you would use them. The idea is to use them with something like your existing docs, your existing images, your existing diagrams to do it for threat modeling. And that's something you can do, of course, with AI. All right, folks, I think we have come to the end of our session today. Thank you so much. I hope you found this useful. And I look forward to another one. In fact, we have very exciting webinars and workshops planned publicly very soon. And you'll see information from us coming up pretty soon as well. On top of that, I also wanted to mention a couple of things today before we close. There is a Fool Me Once sale going on, which is for April Fool's Day, and the sale is real, by the way, it's not an April Fool's sale. So you basically need to use the code Foolproof35. And let me actually post it. It's called foolproof 35, and you get 35% off on AppSecEngineer plans, which is the annual plans, Pro and Pro Plus. You get it on the Pro and Pro Plus plan, you get 35% off if you use the foolproof 35 plan. All right. Thank you very much, and I hope you had a useful session. Have a good rest of your day wherever you are, and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.